At 12 years old, Doris Duke inherited the bulk of one of America's great private fortunes. But the fortune came with a problem no lawyer could solve. From that moment on, almost everyone who entered her life knew exactly what she was worth. Doris could rarely know what they wanted in return. Later accounts attached 2 words to a warning her father was said to have left behind. Trust no one. Over the next 7 decades, 2 marriages would fail, a daughter would live for only about a day, and another woman would enter Doris's life as an adopted daughter and later become estranged. And when Doris herself died, the people closest to her would become part of a bitter argument over money, influence, and what had happened during her final months. The mystery of Doris Duke is not simply whether wealth made her lonely. It is whether someone surrounded by that much money could ever know when affection was real. Doris Duke was born in New York City on November 22, 1912, the only child of James Buchanan Duke and Nanaline Holt Inman Duke. Her father was already one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. Tobacco had made the Duke name famous, and electric power extended the family's reach even further. Doris entered the world with access to comfort, education, travel, and security, on a scale few children could have understood. But privilege did not mean an ordinary childhood. She was educated largely by governesses, tutors, and private instructors. She studied languages and music, and received the kind of individual attention only enormous wealth could provide. What she missed was more ordinary: classmates, arguments, friendships, mistakes, and the everyday experience of learning who another person was when neither money nor employment stood between them. Almost every adult around Doris occupied some role connected to the Duke household. That did not leave her deprived of opportunity. She had more opportunity than almost anyone. What she had less of was practice at judging relationships in which the Duke name meant nothing. Her father appears to have cared deeply about preparing her for the responsibility the family fortune would eventually bring. But preparing a child for wealth is not the same as preparing a child for intimacy. One requires lessons in assets, expectations, and reputation. The other requires experience with uncertainty, disappointment, trust, and sometimes being wrong about another person. When James Duke's health failed in 1925, Doris was only 12. His death changed her position almost overnight. She inherited the bulk of a vast estate through trusts that would come increasingly under her control as she reached adulthood. Newspapers seized on the story. The quiet child of an industrial empire was suddenly presented to the country as one of the richest young women in the world. Later accounts say James Duke left his daughter with a blunt warning: trust no one. Whether those were his exact final words is harder to establish than later retellings sometimes suggest. But the phrase survived because it described a problem the fortune had already created. Anyone entering Doris's life knew what she possessed, but she could rarely be equally certain about what they wanted. And the first serious test of that uncertainty did not come from a stranger. It came from inside her own family. After James Duke died, money and property became sources of conflict between Doris and her mother, Nanaline. At an age when most teenagers depended entirely on a parent, Doris was already caught in disputes involving assets that were technically hers, but inseparable from a family relationship. Money was no longer something outside the home. It had entered the relationship between mother and daughter. Nothing in the surviving record establishes that Nanaline cared only about her daughter's fortune. Family conflict is rarely that simple. But for a young heiress already being taught caution, the distinction became harder to make. Perhaps the most damaging lesson was not that people could either care about Doris or want her money. It was that both things could be true at the same time. Someone might genuinely love her and still benefit from the fortune. If so, there was no simple test that could ever give Doris certainty. If money could complicate the relationship that should have felt safest, what would happen when strangers began saying they loved her? Doris also wanted a life that was not defined entirely by the role others had prepared for her. She expressed interest in higher education. Her mother preferred a more conventional social path for a young woman of their class. Instead of college, Doris was pushed toward travel, society, and the debutante world. The timing made that visibility especially strange. By 1930, ordinary Americans were entering the worst years of the Great Depression. Yet newspapers remained fascinated by heiresses whose fortunes seemed almost unreal by comparison. Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, became recurring figures in that coverage. The press paired them because both had inherited enormous fortunes while young. It was convenient journalism, but it also flattened two very different women into one fantasy of effortless wealth. Doris increasingly resisted it. She learned that a private decision could become entertainment simply because her name was attached to it. A relationship could become a headline written by people who had never spoken to her. She became reluctant to pose for photographers and increasingly unwilling to cooperate with reporters. Pulling away gave Doris something the inheritance itself could not: control over how much of her private life the public was allowed to consume. Privacy had begun as something imposed on her during childhood. Now she defended it herself. But control created another question. Could walls protect her from exploitation without also making closeness harder? By her early 20s, Doris had money, independence, and a name recognized far beyond her own social circle. What she still did not have was certainty about other people's motives. Marriage tested that almost immediately. In 1935, Doris married James H.R. Cromwell, a socially connected man 16 years her senior. He was experienced, politically ambitious, and comfortable in circles where wealth and influence overlapped. For Doris, marriage offered the possibility of a life beyond the strange isolation of heiress culture. Money and ambition soon entered the relationship anyway. Cromwell moved into public service and political life. Doris's resources and his ambitions became entangled in ways that made the marriage difficult to separate from the financial world surrounding it. That financial connection alone does not establish that Cromwell married Doris for money, but from Doris's position, it created another uncertainty. Where did affection end and advantage begin? And then came the loss. No fortune could negotiate away. In 1940, Doris gave birth prematurely to a daughter, Arden. The baby survived for only about a day. Until then, money had complicated almost everything in Doris's life. It could attract attention, it could hire lawyers, it could protect property, it could turn marriage into a financial question. Here, it could do nothing. For perhaps the first time in Doris's life, there had been a relationship untouched by the question of money. A newborn child could not want the Duke fortune. There was no motive to examine, no advantage to calculate, no reason to ask what Arden wanted from her. And then, after barely a day, that relationship was gone. There is no evidence that Doris consciously understood the loss in those terms. But decades later, when she formed an extraordinary bond with another woman and eventually made that woman her legal daughter, the echo of Arden would become difficult to ignore. Doris would never raise the child she had carried. That story was still more than 40 years away. For the moment, grief entered a marriage already under pressure. Doris and Cromwell separated. The divorce became bitter and public. Financial disputes and hostile statements turned the end of the relationship into exactly the kind of spectacle Doris had spent years trying to avoid. Whatever private affection had once existed was now being argued through lawyers, newspapers, and money. A few years later, Doris tried marriage again. In 1947, she married Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat and international social figure whose reputation for romance and luxury was already well established. Texas History Online. This time, Doris entered the marriage differently. She used a prenuptial agreement to sharply limit what Rubirosa could claim from her fortune. The gossip columns loved the arrangement, but the contract revealed something more important. Doris had learned how to protect money. That did not mean she had learned how to measure love. Rubirosa moved through glamorous social circles and already carried a public image built around romance, polo, diplomacy, and wealthy women. Doris could define the legal boundaries of the marriage, but she could not write sincerity into a contract. Financial caution could reduce financial risk. It could not tell her whether affection was genuine. The marriage lasted only a short time, and when it ended, the question remained. 2 failed marriages make a tempting moral. Her father had warned her. He had been right. Everyone wanted the fortune, but the evidence does not justify something that simple. Doris had married 2 very different men, and both relationships failed for reasons more complicated than one warning from childhood. What the marriages reinforced was uncertainty. Wealth never stopped Doris from wanting love. It simply attached an extra question to every relationship. Would this person still be here if the money disappeared? Money could protect Doris from financial loss, but it could never certify another person's intentions. Doris continued to have relationships and friendships, but over time, some of the most stable attachments in her life were not people. They were places. If people could disappoint her, buildings offered a different kind of certainty. A room would not flatter her for access to an inheritance. A garden could be changed without hidden motives. A collection could be studied, rearranged, expanded, and preserved. Doris could decide what entered a property, what stayed, what changed, and who was allowed through the gate. Over the years, she poured enormous energy into homes that became far more than residences. Duke Farms in New Jersey was the clearest link to her father. James Duke had assembled the property, but Doris spent decades reshaping it. She expanded gardens, maintained greenhouses, collected plants, and used the estate as both a private refuge and a working landscape. The inheritance gave her the property. What happened to it afterward reflected her own decisions. It is tempting to interpret every gate and private drive in Doris Duke's life as evidence of fear. Some of them certainly protected her from unwanted attention, but privacy also created room for interests the newspapers barely noticed. Rough Point in Newport became another expression of that independence. The house filled with art, furniture, textiles, porcelain, and objects acquired over years of collecting. Doris spent long periods there, refining rooms and studying what she owned. She was not simply accumulating expensive things because she could afford them. The collections reflected curiosity and judgment. Rough Point also became connected to one of the darkest incidents in Doris's life. In 1966, Doris was driving a car that struck and killed Eduardo Tirella, a man who had worked with her at the Newport estate. Police concluded at the time that Tirella's death was an accident. Decades later, new allegations and a previously unheard witness revived questions about whether the crash had happened differently. Newport police reviewed the case again in 2021. The review found no new information sufficient to change the original conclusion that Tirella's death had been accidental. BostonGlobe.com. That distinction matters. The later allegations created a disturbing alternative story, but they did not establish that Doris intentionally killed him. Then there was Shangri-La in Honolulu. Of all Doris's properties, it may reveal most clearly the difference between an heiress who merely possessed wealth and a collector who developed a sustained interest. Travel through North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia deepened her fascination with Islamic art and architecture. She commissioned, purchased, adapted, and assembled decorative elements over many years. The architecture and collection were designed to work together. This was not a one-time decorating project. Doris returned to it repeatedly. She studied forms, acquired objects, worked with craftsmen, and continued changing the property long after the initial construction. Shangri-La gave her a field where the public identity of richest girl mattered less than personal judgment. Here, money expanded what she could do rather than simply attracting people toward her. Her travels also brought her into contact with spiritual traditions far outside the world in which she had been raised. Accounts describe meetings with teachers and mystics in India and a broader curiosity about belief and religious practice. It would be easy to turn that into another neat psychological explanation, a lonely heiress searching for meaning. The record does not require that conclusion. What can be said is simpler. Doris was curious. Her curiosity went beyond possessions into questions of culture, belief, and how other people understood life. In California, she acquired Falcon Lair, once owned by silent film star Rudolph Valentino. The property gave her privacy in the hills above Los Angeles. Years later, it would become the setting for the most disputed chapter of her life. At the time, it was simply another place where Doris controlled access and stepped away from public attention. She also maintained a residence in Manhattan. Across New Jersey, Newport, Honolulu, California, and New York, Doris could move between several very different worlds. Maintaining those properties required gardeners, housekeepers, drivers, secretaries, cooks, caretakers, and security personnel. That created a strange contradiction. Doris could isolate herself from the public only because a large number of people worked around her every day. So was she actually alone? Not literally. Her life contained employees, advisors, artists, craftsmen, acquaintances, and people connected to her estates. The harder question was whether she could tell which relationships existed independently of the fortune paying for the entire system. The estates therefore tell a more useful story than the most eccentric anecdotes attached to her wealth. Doris used money to protect her privacy, but she also used it to build, preserve, collect, and create environments that reflected her interests rather than somebody else's expectations. And she did not keep all of that wealth for herself. That complicates the stereotype of the selfish recluse. While still a young woman, Doris established a charitable organization called Independent Aid. Over the decades, philanthropy became one of the most consistent parts of her public legacy. It attracted less attention than her marriages, mansions, or legal disputes. Scandal produces better headlines than grants. But the giving continued. Doris supported arts organizations and performers. She backed historic preservation. Environmental projects received funding. Her own properties increasingly became connected to conservation as well as private use. Medical causes mattered too. In 1993, Doris gave $2 million to Duke University for AIDS research. Shortly before her death, she contributed $1 million to the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. Both gifts came during a period when AIDS had already taken an enormous human toll and still carried deep stigma. She supported educational efforts as well. Not every donation was designed to generate publicity. Doris could be intensely protective of her private life while still putting substantial resources into causes benefiting people she would never meet. Someone can be guarded about personal relationships and still be generous toward strangers. Perhaps institutions felt safer because they did not pretend to love her. A university could use a grant. A medical program could fund research. Neither required Doris to decide whether affection was sincere. That interpretation fits the larger pattern, but it remains an interpretation. What is documented is simpler. Doris gave substantial resources away and supported causes over long periods. She used wealth to protect her privacy, but she also directed large sums toward causes and institutions. Giving, however, was not the same as family. More than 4 decades after Arden's death, Doris formed another mother-daughter bond. The woman who entered her life was Chandi Hefner. Doris met Chandi in the 1980s. By then, Doris was in her 70s and more than 40 years removed from the brief life of Arden. Later accounts describe the relationship as having an unusually deep emotional and spiritual significance. Doris came to associate Chandi in some way with the daughter she had lost. Whether that connection was understood literally, spiritually, or symbolically is difficult to establish from the surviving record. What is easier to establish is what Doris did next. In 1988, she legally adopted Chandi as an adult daughter. This was not treated as a minor technical arrangement. Doris provided substantial financial support, property, valuable gifts, and access to a life that very few people could enter. For a time, the relationship appeared to give Doris something neither marriage had managed to sustain: a daughter who was alive, present, and legally part of her family. Perhaps Doris was attempting something marriage had never been able to give her. Not merely affection, but a relationship protected by law. Adoption made Chandi family. Property and financial support gave that bond another form of security. Whether Doris believed those protections could make the relationship permanent is impossible to know. But if she did, what happened later would carry a significance far beyond money. Money was involved, of course. Money was always involved in Doris Duke's life. But reading the adoption simply as an attempt to purchase another daughter would flatten the relationship into a story the evidence cannot support. Generosity was one of the ways Doris expressed attachment. The deeper question was whether legal and financial security could protect a relationship from the doubt that had complicated so many others. For a few years, the arrangement seemed to hold. Then it collapsed. By the early 1990s, Doris and Chandi were estranged. The exact cause remained disputed. Doris removed Chandi from her will and cut off the relationship. The legal adoption remained important after Doris's death. Chandi later pursued claims against the estate and eventually dropped them in exchange for a $65 million settlement. The Washington Post. The emotional echo is difficult to miss. Doris had lost one daughter in infancy. More than 4 decades later, she had deliberately built another mother-daughter relationship. Now that relationship was gone too. And one of the people who remained inside the household was Bernard Lafferty. That would matter more with every passing month. Lafferty was an Irish-born servant who had held domestic positions before entering Doris's orbit through Chandi. He had struggled with alcohol. Over time, however, his position inside Doris's household became increasingly important. What began as employment became access. In Doris Duke's world, access was never a small thing. Why Lafferty remained when Chandi did not is one of the more unsettling questions in Doris's final years. Was he trusted? Was he simply useful? Had familiarity made him difficult to replace? Or had increasing physical dependence given him access the younger Doris might never have surrendered? The surviving record cannot tell us exactly how Doris judged him privately. What it does show is that Lafferty's influence increased at almost the same time Doris's physical independence was declining. By the time Doris and Chandi separated, Lafferty remained, and Doris's health was beginning to fail. For decades, Doris had controlled who entered her homes, where she traveled, how her money was managed, and how much of herself the public could see. Now that balance was reversing. In 1992, Doris underwent cosmetic surgery in California. During recovery, she fell and fractured her hip. The injury required further treatment and marked the beginning of a steep decline. Medical problems multiplied. Additional procedures followed, including knee surgery. Hospital stays became longer. In 1993, after another operation, Doris suffered a serious stroke. For most of her adult life, wealth had allowed Doris to control access. By the end, illness forced her to depend on other people for basic care. The same fortune that had protected her independence now required a network of people to manage her medication, household, property, and eventually her estate. The person who had spent decades controlling access was becoming dependent on the very thing she had always found hardest to measure: other people's intentions. Falcon Lair changed with her. A private retreat became a medical environment. Nurses rotated through shifts. Doctors managed medications and complications. Doris was increasingly confined, and she was still extraordinarily wealthy. That meant many decisions around her had 2 dimensions: medical care on one side, an enormous estate on the other. Bernard Lafferty's position became more significant as Doris became more dependent. Estate arrangements changed. Lafferty received an important role in administering what Doris would leave behind and stood to receive substantial financial benefits. The arrangement justified scrutiny. It did not by itself establish misconduct. but it guaranteed that decisions around Doris would later be examined through the question that had followed her since childhood. Who could be trusted? Dr. Charles Kiewowitz became one of the central physicians in her care. As Doris's condition worsened, pain medication became part of the treatment. Demerol was used later, morphine. Then, on October 28, 1993, Doris Duke died at Falcon Lair. She was 80 years old. Her death was officially attributed to pulmonary edema leading to cardiac arrest. Her body was cremated soon afterward. No autopsy was performed. That alone would have attracted attention. But there was more. A recently altered estate, a powerful employee positioned to benefit financially, heavy medication in the final days, a rapid cremation, no autopsy. None of those facts establishes wrongdoing. But together, they raise an uncomfortable question. Had Doris's declining health simply made her dependent on people she trusted? Or had dependence itself changed who held the power around her? Suspicion was almost inevitable. Then a nurse who had cared for Doris made allegations that transformed that suspicion into public controversy. Tammy Payette claimed Doris had not been as close to death as her doctors suggested when the strongest medications were introduced. She questioned the severity of the pain described in the medical account and alleged that treatment may have contributed to the deterioration that followed. Payette also claimed Doris wanted to return to the hospital and that the request was not acted upon. If true, those allegations would have been serious. But they were allegations, not findings. Payette's credibility later suffered substantial damage when she became involved in criminal theft cases involving valuables taken from wealthy patients. That later misconduct did not automatically make every allegation about Doris false. It did mean her claims required scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance. The allegations eventually triggered a criminal investigation. After an extended inquiry, Los Angeles prosecutors said investigators had found no credible evidence of criminal homicide. The investigation involved the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Major Crimes Division and the Los Angeles Police Department's Robbery Homicide Unit. Los Angeles Times. That conclusion did not answer every question about Doris's final medical care. A missing autopsy leaves questions. It does not create answers. A suspicious estate arrangement can justify investigation, but it cannot substitute for evidence. The final care may still invite debate about medical judgment, and we cannot know whether every decision was the best possible one. And because Doris was cremated without an autopsy, some physical questions could never be revisited. But uncertainty cannot be converted into proof of murder. The estate generated a different battle. Chandy, still legally connected to Doris through the adult adoption despite their estrangement, became involved in disputes over the inheritance. Others close to Doris challenged Bernard Lafferty's role and questioned whether he was fit to exercise such authority over the estate and charitable foundation. The proceedings became complicated. Judges and lawyers argued over Lafferty's fitness, administration of the estate, and how control of Doris's charitable assets should be handled. Those proceedings did not establish that Lafferty had secretly engineered Doris's death. The probate fight was primarily about an extraordinary fortune and whether the people Doris had chosen could properly carry out her wishes. Eventually, charitable assets moved under the control of trustees. The philanthropic structures Doris had supported during her lifetime continued after the personal battles around her estate began to fade. That produces a striking contradiction. Her final years were marked by estrangement, medical dependence, distrust, accusations, and arguments over money. Yet much of the fortune at the center of those disputes ultimately continued serving causes she had supported for decades. The death controversy became more famous. Mystery is easier to dramatize than administration. A billionaire dies. A butler benefits. A nurse makes accusations. The body has already been cremated. It sounds like the beginning of a murder story, but the evidence never produced one. And that leaves a more interesting question. Not simply who may have caused Doris Duke's death, but what kind of life left one of the wealthiest women in America dependent, in her final months, on employees, doctors, and advisors, while many of the intimate relationships that had once mattered most had already broken apart. Doris Duke did not die literally alone. Nurses were there. Employees were there. Doctors and advisors were there. The harder question is whether she knew which relationships would have survived without the fortune. By the time Doris died, both marriages had been over for decades. The daughter she gave birth to had lived about a day. The woman she later adopted had become estranged. Some of the people with the greatest access to her were financially dependent on her or connected to the administration of her estate. That does not mean none of them cared. And perhaps that is the cruelest possibility in Doris Duke's story. She may never have been choosing between people who loved her and people who wanted something from her. The same person could have done both. Someone could care about Doris and still benefit from her wealth. An employee could feel loyalty and still depend on her financially. A relative could feel affection and still care about inheritance. A husband could love her and still enjoy everything marriage to Doris Duke made possible. If those motives could coexist, then the question that had followed her since childhood had no clean answer. How could she tell the difference? For most people, affection and money can become tangled. For Doris, they appeared together almost everywhere. In marriage, family disputes, employment, friendships, charitable giving, estate planning, and finally, the medical system surrounding her last months. That brings the story back to the warning attributed to her father. Trust no one. Later accounts turn those words into a perfect explanation for Doris Duke. Her mother became involved in financial conflict with her. Both marriages failed. One husband had political ambitions intertwined with wealth. The adopted daughter became estranged. Bernard Lafferty's position created years of suspicion and litigation. Lined up that way, the warning looks prophetic. But a life does not run on one cause. Doris was shaped by childhood, press scrutiny, the loss of her daughter, 2 failed marriages, her temperament, her choices, and the unusual difficulty of living as a person whose financial value was known before almost anyone had the chance to know her privately. The warning describes the problem. It does not explain every decision Doris made in response to it. Her wealth deserves the same nuance. The easiest moral would be that Doris had everything and discovered money could not buy happiness. That is tidy, but it is also incomplete. Money gave Doris extraordinary freedom. It allowed her to travel widely, study art and architecture, shape Duke farms, build Shangri-La, preserve historic spaces, support performers, fund medical research, back conservation, and give to causes that outlasted her. Those accomplishments were real. So were the failed relationships. The fortune expanded her choices and complicated her intimacy at the same time. That contradiction may be the most useful way to understand Doris Duke. Her homes can appear from the outside, like monuments to isolation. Controlled entrances, large staffs, private rooms, and expensive objects. But inside those same properties were decades of collecting, gardening, preservation, research, design, and artistic interest. Doris was not merely hiding there, she was working on them. Her philanthropy complicates the loneliness story even further. The woman, remembered for mistrust, repeatedly placed resources in the hands of researchers, conservationists, educators, performers, and institutions. Perhaps those relationships felt simpler because nobody had to pretend they were personal. Perhaps not. Either way, generosity and suspicion existed in the same life. So did independence and dependence, privacy and exposure, control and vulnerability. Doris Duke did not end as a simple cautionary tale about wealth. Nor does the evidence support reducing her to a victim surrounded only by fortune hunters. There were people who exploited proximity to wealth. There were also people who worked with Doris, cared for her, shared interests with her, and remained connected to projects she valued. The record shows both exploitation and relationships that cannot simply be dismissed as financial. The controversy surrounding her death deserves the same restraint. The rapid cremation, absence of an autopsy, estate changes, medication, and allegations created understandable suspicion. But suspicion did not become proof of murder. The more compelling mystery lies elsewhere. What did Doris herself believe about the people around her as she became increasingly dependent on them? Did she still trust Bernard Lafferty? Did she regret the rupture with Chandi? Did the nurses and employees around her feel like care, obligation, or some mixture of both? The record cannot answer those questions for her. And perhaps that is why Doris Duke has been so easy to turn into a symbol. In youth, newspapers made her the richest girl in the world. During her marriages, she became glamorous heiress material for gossip columns. Later came the eccentric billionaire, the recluse, the collector, the adopted daughter, the suspicious butler, the contested death. Each version contains something real, but none contains the whole woman. Doris Duke lived for 80 years. Only the first 12 came before the inheritance that would dominate almost every account written about her afterward. For the rest of her life, the fortune was almost always in the room, even when the subject was love, grief, art, belief, generosity, or family. Money gave Doris the power to protect herself from almost anyone. It bought lawyers, walls, privacy, travel, medical care, and the freedom to walk away. It also created Shangri-La, preserved architecture, supported research, protected land, funded art, and helped people Doris would never meet. The fortune was not simply her prison, it was also her freedom. The problem was that it followed her everywhere, into friendship, into marriage, into family, and finally, into the room where she died. At 12 years old, Doris Duke inherited enough money to protect herself from a great many dangers. But perhaps that protection contained its own trap. If she trusted too easily, she risked exploitation. If she trusted no one, she risked pushing away people whose affection might have been genuine. There may never have been a perfect test. The fortune could tell Doris exactly what she owned. It could never tell her what another person felt. And that uncertainty, more than the mansions, the inheritance, or the unanswered questions surrounding her death, may be the most unsettling burden Doris Duke never found a way to escape.